even though we've had some reduction in the prevalence of suspensions and the like over time, the disparities still remain. So essentially, Black students are around twice as likely to be suspended than their peers. We also know that male students, students with disabilities, get disciplined at a much higher rate than their peers. And these disparities matter. So we might have heard about the school to prison pipeline. So there's a link between being suspended in schools and not only what happens to your test scores, but also what happens when you leave the school building, right? So your later on incarceration rates, your economic and social outcomes. So I think school discipline is one of, to my mind, and clearly I'm biased, is one of the cornerstones of educational opportunity when we think about advancing the human conditions for students in our school. And the second big reason is I think to my mind there's a disconnect between the wealth of research that we have on school discipline. There are tons of research studies that have examined contributors, the effectiveness of school discipline reform, but there's a disconnect of sorts between, all the work we've been producing and how we're using research. So I wanted to foster, a greater use of research evidence to shape some of the discourse that we're having in school discipline around what's driving the disparities and what we can do about it. So, between the urgency of the topic and the disconnect between research and policy and practice, it kind of gave rise to this book. And it really, I've been researching school discipline for over a decade now. So this is really the culmination of some of the work that I've been doing in past years. You're on mute, Kelly.
Sorry, thanks. Because this book has strategic, usable kind of skills that it's providing people to kind of start to change the disciplining strategies in schools, who is the person that this book is written for? And who are best the audience to use it?
The folks who I think are doing the hard work on the front lines. So this is, aimed at district and school leadership. So this is for my principals and assistant principals who are managing the disciplinary process in schools. This is for my superintendents, my associate superintendents of school climate, the directors of behavior support, all the folks in the central office that are making decisions on what policies or programs that we're going to implement to disrupt some of these discipline disparities. Also wrote it for the broader school personnel. I think teachers will find this book useful as well, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, all the folks who are involved in the disciplinary process in schools. And then, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my Vandy colleagues who are in the same building that I am now. Many of them are on the call. But the tertiary audience would be for my fellow scholars. So, kind of taking stock of where we are in the school discipline literature and trying to inspire new fruitful directions for new research.
As you did the research and wrote this book, did you feel there was any disconnect or people who were not kind of open to the ideas of what you were forming and sharing as ways to drive change?
Yeah, well, of course. We have an executive order that came down the pike last month, that I think is a little bit antithetical to how I would view the role of race and school discipline. We're dealing with a polarizing topic. There's a lot of disagreement about the causes of discipline disparities. Black students get suspended more, but do they misbehave more? The answer is no. We have tons of studies that have shown that. We have tons of studies that have shown how restorative practices are working, how positive behavioral interventions and supports are working. So I think there is, within the broader scope of stakeholders and policymakers, there are some who are going to view the issue differently, and I would say a little bit ahistorical and a little bit divorced from the research evidence. And I think that's, part of one of the big charge with this book is to really lean on and synthesize what is a very robust school discipline literature. We have tons of studies that have told us about the contributors, tons of studies on the effectiveness. So it's really to bring the power of research to bear on a polarizing topic. But I am sure there are a lot of people who, will kind of look at this body of work and have a divergence of opinions. But, I think if we're being honest and true to the research evidence, then I think you'd kind of view discipline disparities in a very similar way.
And we're always super excited when books have tangible, actionable items that people can use. So it's not just identifying the problem and the data that supports the problem, but also what people can do, because they're always looking for outcomes, solutions, changes, actions. So can you share a little bit, an example or two of the kinds of things that are in the book that people could adopt new ideas or practices?
Yeah, I always tell district leaders and school leaders who ask me about the book, I tell them to start with chapter 2. As I think chapter 2 is the whole premise of chapter 2 is exactly that, to provide actionable solutions that are evidence-based. So in that chapter, I present a transforming school discipline strategic framework. So just a way for us to think on it. I provide different steps that we can do along with resources. So, how you can look at your data, what are some of the metrics, what are some of the resources we have there from regional educational labs, providing some guidance on how you can take stock of your current school discipline reform. But I think the biggest kind of actionable point is the multi-tiered school discipline reform strategy. So kind of inspired by MTSS, I, have created a strategic framework that essentially categorizes schools and classrooms, so schools within a district and even classrooms within a school into 3 tiers. And the underlying thinking is that we want to send support to the areas of greatest need. And within that table is essentially what we know about programs and policies that can either A, support students, or B, support our educators. And I kind of use those 2 categories. So, all the studies that have been done on empathy, Greed Stop Prompt, all the different programs we have, the SEL evidence, the school climate evidence. And what I wanted to do was provide something where a superintendent or a school leader could look at it and say, okay, here are the areas that I need to improve in professional development for discipline. Here are a few interventions that I can use. And a part of the thinking when we had, a lot of federal funding for what we try to do in education is that I would provide an evidence base for us to go and seek federal funding. So most of the reforms that I speak about in the multi-tiered school discipline reform strategy are based upon the Every Student Succeeds Act tiers of evidence. So whether or not it's experimental evidence coming from quasi-experimental. So there's actionable steps in what you can do to better understand the problem. I think there are also actionable steps on what research is telling us on what programs are working. And a part of the thinking as well is to use that insights to get funding to implement and sustain a lot of the reforms.
So of course, you brought it up, so I have to ask the question. In our current federal environment, right, and the way grants are happening and things, the challenges that we're facing with getting money, are there other strategies that you would recommend to get, financial support for things like this when people are looking to implement?
I think a lot of it starts with the local context and the local will. I think on school discipline reform in 3 buckets, policy, programs, and personnel. The policy is what most districts are going through now in terms of revising their code of conduct. I think, you can signal a lot on whether you're for a punitive or a non-punitive approach with that policy. I think where a lot of the money comes in is in the programs and the personnel. And I think, districts that are committed to disrupting discipline disparities will find from local sources or from their state sources resources that, can help them in professional development, um, in implementing and sustaining programs such as restorative practices, which you're gonna need training, you're gonna need coordinators. Um, I would say is looking more towards the state buckets and maybe looking towards some of the nonprofit buckets as well. So we have a whole ecosystem or I should say, a growing ecosystem of players, right? So your cross-sector partnerships, your foundations, nonprofits that's doing work in juvenile justice and related areas, I think can help us get funding to sustain and implement some of these reforms. But I think you're exactly right. I think all of us are kind of holding our breath and kind of seeing how things play out because, without a doubt, the federal involvement in school discipline and the federal bucket of funds do matter. So we'd hope that that would be, resource that's available to us moving forward.
One other thing that dawned on me is there any difference in the data or in the activation or implementation based on type of environment, meaning urban, suburban, rural? Like, have you seen differences in those different environments or regions?
I don't know if we have tons of work on the implementation across the different environments. Most of our work have focused a lot on large urban districts. I have some work coming now that uses nationwide data to compare districts and regions. So we haven't really had that comparative view. From what we know about implementation, it's super difficult. The schools with the highest suspending schools and districts, unsurprisingly, tend to struggle more with some of the implementation. But that's one of the areas where we do need, I think, a lot of future research and informed thought on how we can better implement. And to your question, what are some of the variations in implementation that we see across contexts? But I don't know if we have a lot of research literature to lean on to say, how urban schools implement restorative practices versus how, a rural school or a suburban school do it. What are the particular differences?
Okay, well, that's helpful. We have a bunch of questions coming in, so
Nice.
um, I don't know if this will resonate. So one of the questions from Victoria is, oh, sorry, hold on. How to prospect the next directions in the field work.
Good question. I am looking at that now. I'll tell you a little bit of how I think on it. I think we need to better develop the ecology of school discipline. So what I mean by that is when I think on discipline, it's a within school process. It's happening with the teachers and the principals and the students within schools, but I think we've overlooked how much of what happens in schools are shaped by the surrounding context. And I think in expanding, to school discipline to how it might be shaped by the pandemic, how it might be shaped by neighborhoods. I think we also expand the, the actors that can come to play to disrupt these disparities. So this might not only be a challenge for superintendents, but this might be a conversation that superintendents might need to have with mayors. And going back to your resource question, this can also be a way for us to open up a whole new set of resources. So I think we have a lot of understanding on within school factors. I think that the next frontier is linking it with outer school factors, um, seeing how school, family, community relationships shape school discipline. And then I also think a next lane for us to go in is just, you know, a lot of the reforms and the initiatives that, research tells us is working. A big part of it is expanding capacity and training. And I think if we were to say, okay, what school discipline specific professional development are districts doing and how effective are they? And I think those are two questions that we can answer a bit more clearly moving forward. So to my mind, the frontiers are, better understanding the ecology of school discipline, which will give us a sense of how outer school factors are contributing to what we're seeing. And then the next part is get drilling a little bit deeper into how we're training and expanding the capacity of the school personnel that we want to do this important work. And I'd probably add one more to your earlier point about looking at discipline in different contexts. Right, so there's a need for us to use nationwide data, district level data to compare what's happening in the South versus what's happening in the Northeast versus the West. And, a big part of what I advance in this book and some of the work that I'm doing is that we need to reverse engineer success, right? So it's not all doom and gloom. We do have districts and schools that are beating the school discipline odds. There's a lot of innovation happening in school discipline that haven't been fully captured by the research literature as well. And I think if we have these more comparison national level studies, we can better identify those cases and start to learn from them. You're on mute again, Kelly.
There's some background noise, so I apologize. I keep going on mute to avoid that. So the next question is, what sources do you use for deeming interventions evidence-based?
I use the ESSA tiers of evidence. So there's a tiers of evidence from the Every Student Succeed Act, kind of growing out from some of the thinking we have about what's evidence-based. I'll be the first to admit I don't think it's perfect. One of the big, critiques I have of it is kind of how we categorize some of our qualitative and mixed method study. But the ESSA tiers of evidence gives us four tiers, starting with your experimental, your randomized controlled trials. Those is what we had put in quotations as a quantitative guide, the gold standard. And then we kind of go down to our quasi-experimental, then we go down to our descriptive studies, and then you have a fourth tier. So in my mind, I kind of rank the evidence according to the ESSA tiers of evidence framework. So I would say from tier one through to tier three is what we'd consider strong evidence or evidence-based. So, when I say evidence-based, it means that we've had a research study or a few research studies, or in some cases, a body of literature that have provided empirical evidence on how it is working and whether or not it is working.
Great. Let's see. So curious if you touch on problem-solving based interventions like collaborative and proactive solutions from Dr. Ross Green.
I am familiar with some of Dr. Green's work. That would be, I won't touch on it fully. I mentioned some of the similar issues that motivate, but if I'm remembering right, I did not find many studies that have provided that empirical evidence on innovations like CPA. There are many other type innovations as well. There's Be Well in Schools here in Nashville and Kentucky that focus more on mindfulness. I think there's a group of innovations that haven't quite gotten the evidence base as yet, and that that's some of the ideas I have for the second book in terms of thinking through what districts and schools are actually doing, but we might not have had the research study to support what they're doing as yet.
From Victoria, are there things that individual educators can do to fight against disciplinary disparities and in support inclusive learning?
Yeah, we ask so much of our schools and our educators today, but I think, my answer to that question is to lead with empathy. I think when we think about our classrooms today, there's a demographic mismatch of sorts, right? Our teachers are mostly white male, middle class females. Our students are increasingly diverse. They come from different neighborhoods, they come from different backgrounds, they've had different experiences. And I think, especially with the pandemic and the uptick in behavior and socialization and skills kind of eroding, students struggle with how they relate to adults. Students struggle with how they relate to their peers. They love profanity. For a teacher, I think I can just ask that you lead with empathy and expand your skills. I am the son of a teacher, so I try to go to aims in the book not to blame teachers. This is not a blame game. There are a lot of structural deficiencies in teacher preparation program. There are a lot of structural deficiencies in on-the-job support for teachers. So I would ask teachers to lead with empathy and expand their skills, right? So the they don't need to criminalize or adultify some students and not others. I think it's remembering that we're dealing with children, they're still developing, they're still growing. There's going to be some disconnects in how they may speak to you, how they may relate to you. So, empathy skills and build relationships. And I think, when we look at some of the evidence, for example, more experienced teachers tend to have less discipline issues. And I think that comes over time by enhancing their classroom management, enhancing their relationship building, enhancing their cultural responsiveness. So I think for teachers, I'd want them to teach and just, the mantra would be support, not suspend.
Great. And then could you share an anecdote of a school district or school leader who has addressed disciplinary disparities in effective ways? So an example of something you found in your work and in the implementation.
Yeah, I've done that at two levels so far. So, I've tried to find districts that are beating the school discipline odds. We have some work coming. Shout out to Baltimore County Public Schools. I think that's one of the few predominantly Black districts in the South where, if you look at their prevalence and disparities, and they're doing tons of things in terms of supporting. I would take it down to the school level. So we did a similar study where we identified schools that are beating the odds in New York, and we have a follow-up study where we actually went into these schools, interviewed the principals, the assistant principals, counselors to try and get a sense of what they're doing. In those schools, relationship building, a sense of authenticity and welcoming for their students. School leaders are pivotal. So, they're the stick that stirs the drink in so to speak, in terms of setting the climate. Um, and then I think also too, there's a disposition to just, we are not going to resort to punitive issues. So, a lot of the time I think expectations are just understood. But the more I am interacting with schools and districts, being very explicit about the expectations, and there's a timing to it as well. At the start of the year, expectations not only for your students, but expectations for your teachers, your assistant principals, how you want them to show up, how you want them to manage and monitor your hallways, how you want them to, ask for support if they need it. The next big thing I'd say this school does is teacher well-being and educator well-being. We tend to gloss over that, and I think the pandemic has amplified the needs, not only the needs of students, but the needs of our educators, from burnout to mental health. So I think when you have a school leader that is intentional and invest in the well-being of their teachers and the well-being of staff, it goes a long way. So there's some work coming down the pike that will kind of outline some of the specific ways in which they can develop school climate and develop this sense of authenticity and belonging. But I think it's the leader, their ethos, and these practices, and I think a lot of the practices just stem from, we understand that when students are suspended or in discipline, they're gonna lose instructional time, and we're trying to avoid that.
Great. So that's all the questions we have. Is there anything that you feel like I didn't ask that you wanted to share with the audience? Or make sure we captured?
No, go get the book. Look forward to the feedback, and yeah, keep disrupting discipline disparities.
Thank you so much. I just actually put in the chat, I put our web address, but I will actually send an email to everybody who attended with a discount code, so that they can order the book at a 20% discount. So I will do that when following this session. We will also send out the recording once it's available. But
Perfect.
thank you again, Richard. We really appreciate the work. We appreciate the book. It's really important and timely, and really feel like our audience will really benefit from it. So thank you for sharing the time. Oh, someone just raised their hand, and we have a minute or two. So let me just see.
Yeah.
They raised their hand, but I don't know if I can get them to speak. Let me see. Oh, let me check the question. Oh, sorry. So there is one additional question. Do you have time for one more?
Of course.
You spoke of the effectiveness of restorative practices, but aren't those equally late in the process of supporting kids versus proactively?
It depends on how you implement it, right? So I think at first glance, restorative practice can seem reactive, right? So it's when there's a consequence, or when there's an infraction. So if a student act out or a student fight, then are we going to do a circle or that? But to my mind, restorative practices is way more. And the key for restorative practice to me is for it to be embedded in tier one, right? So when restorative practices are really humming, a lot of the times we don't even see the benefits. It's a student coming to a teacher before they get into a fight and say, hey, I want a circle. It is how we kind of couple restorative practices with SEL and advisement sessions. So yes, it can, most of the times when we think on it now, it's a reactive tool, but if we really implement it in a true fashion, it should become a part of the school climate. It should become a part of tier one, and we should activate some of the proactive elements of it. I think what tends to happen with restorative practices, because we're so fixated on it being punitive or restorative, I think we kind of lose the balance that we need, right? There are some offenses that, even as someone that says support and not suspend, there are going to be some non-negotiables. But those are not the bulk of the offenses that we deal with in school discipline. Most of what we deal with are subjective offenses that relates on the discretion of educators. So if we're building a community, if we're building the conflict resolution skills, we should proactively see restorative practices show up rather than it being, oh, you've committed an infraction, either you get suspended or you do a circle. So I agree that, oftentimes we get stuck in that reactive mode, but I think part of the growth and the evolution of really implementing restorative practices is for it to be a proactive tool as well.
Perfect. That's a great way to end. So thank you so much, Richard. And
Thank you, Kelly.
I
I
will send
appreciate it.
out an email shortly, but I appreciate the time.
Yes, ma'am. Have a
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining.